Hello and welcome to the next section in Unit 11. So this section is all about complex numbers. Another word for complex numbers, another phrase, is imaginary numbers. So that is where we get this letter I. So I kind of stands for imaginary. So a couple days ago, the other day, I said we did not know how to deal with negative numbers inside of a square root, but this complex numbers is going to tell us how to deal with those and how to solve functions or solve equations with negative numbers inside of a square root. So the reason it's called imaginary numbers is because they're not real numbers. So that's why we were saying no real solution, because if you have a negative inside the square root, it's not a real number, but we have imaginary numbers to help us deal with those. So one thing you need to know is that I is equal to the square root of -1. So that's like the basic thing that we need to know about all of these equations that we're dealing with. So a little quick example here is that if you have the square root of -a, another way to write that is the square root of -1 times a. And then you can simplify that to equal the square root of -1 times the square root of a. But the square root of -1 is I. So then I can write I times the square root of a. So basically what happens when we have a negative inside of a square root, if I multiply the square root times I, the negative inside of there goes away. So in example 1, if I'm trying to solve or simplify the square root of -12, if I want to get rid of this negative, which I do, I need to multiply the square root times I, and then the negative goes away because the square root, or excuse me, I equals the square root of -1. So now that I have the square root of 12, I can simplify that. So remember when we simplified radicals, so we got to break it down. So 4 times 3, oops, I wrote the wrong number there. And then 4 is 2 times 2. So I got a pair of 2's, one comes out, the other one goes away, so 2 root 3. So my answer is not 2 root 3 because I have an I there, so it'll be 2 times I times root 3. So that's kind of how you deal with negative numbers. So I know this probably doesn't make a ton of sense yet, so let's do some more examples. So if I have the square root of -25, to get rid of that negative, multiply times I, and then I have I times the square root of 25. Now I know the square root of 25 is 5, so our answer will be 5I, because we still have that I there. Square root of -6, so to get rid of the square root, get rid of the negative, multiply times I, then becomes I times the square root of 6. Now if you're trying to break down 6, you cannot, so you just leave your answer this way because 6 cannot be simplified anymore. And then, so I times square root of 11, I can't break down 11 anymore, so that's my answer. So moving on to example 2. So we're pretty much doing the same thing here. I want to get rid of the negative, so I multiply it times I. Square root of 36 is 6, so my answer is 6I. So I want to get rid of this negative, so I'll multiply it times I. So I have I times the square root of 18. Now I can break down 18. I know 9 times 2 is 18. 3 times 3 is 9. 3 comes out, the other one goes away, so I have 3 root 2. So 3 comes out, there's already an I out there, so I just multiply them together, so 3I, and then 2 stays on the inside, times the square root of 2. So 3I root 2 is my answer. So a complex number is any number that has an I in it. So the way we will write it, you'll either see something like 6i, or you'll see a number plus a number times I. So like, or minus, it could be minus. So for example, in example 3, we have 7 minus 2i. That's an example of a complex number. This is the form that you'll see it in a lot of times. So example 3 is telling us to simplify by dealing with this sign. So this tells us to add. So we're just combining like terms. So I have a 7 and a negative 3. So 7 minus 3 is 4. I have a negative 2i and a positive I. So that's just negative 1i or negative I. So 4 minus I would be my answer. So again, all we're doing is combining like terms. So 1 minus 3. If you want, you could even just write it like this, reorder it so the like terms are together. So 1 minus 3, and then we have a plus 5i minus a negative 2i. But when we have two minuses in a row, that turns into a plus. So 1 minus 3 is negative 2. 5i plus 2i is 7i. So negative 2 plus 7i would be our answer. Oops. So moving on to the next page. So you just got to add or subtract whatever the signs tell us to do. So I got 8 minus 8, and then negative 6i, or minus 6i, minus a negative 6i. When I have a minus minus, it turns into a plus. So 8 minus 8 is 0. Negative 6i plus 6i is also 0. 0 minus 0 is 0. So our answer is 0. So sometimes the i's will cancel out, and in this case everything cancels out. So next one, negative 3 plus 3. Then I have a positive 9i plus 9i. Negative 3 plus 3, that's 0. 9i plus 9i is 18i, so my answer is just 18i. In this next little section here, we're going to multiply. So we were just adding and subtracting complex numbers. Now we're going to multiply. So if they're in this form, we're going to have to do FOIL or that box. So if I wanted to multiply these two together, I would do the box. If you like FOIL or remember how to do FOIL, you can do it that way. So I am going to put 3 minus 2i on the side, and then 5 minus 4i on top. So then I just multiply these two sides. So 3 times 5 is 15. Negative 2i times 5 is negative 10i. 3 times negative 4 is negative 12i. And then negative 2i times negative 4i is positive 8i squared. So if I have I times I, it's just I squared, just like if we have x times x. So now I'm going to combine all these like terms. So I'm going to add them all together. So 15 minus 12i minus 10i plus 8i squared. Combine like terms. Negative 12 minus 10 is negative 22. So negative 22i plus 8i squared. All right, so one thing you need to know, when you're dealing with complex numbers, never leave an exponent on I, because you can always simplify that. So at the very beginning, we said the square root of negative 1 is equal to I. But if we have I squared, that equals the square root of negative 1 squared. So if you square a square root, these two just cancel each other out. So this I squared is equal to negative 1. So whenever you see I squared, just substitute in negative 1. So 15 minus 22i plus 8 times negative 1. So that's negative 8. So 15 minus 22i minus 8. So 15 minus 8 is 7. So 7 minus 22i would be our answer. So again, when you're dealing with complex numbers, you should only have a whole number and then a number times I, or at the most. Never any exponents on I. All right, so example 5. So this is just like if these were x. So 7 times 3 is 21. I times I is I squared, but I squared is negative 1. So 21 times negative 1 is negative 21. Negative 4 times 5 is negative 20. And then I times I is I squared. But I squared is negative 1. So negative 20 times negative 1 is positive 20. So now we got two little FOIL things here to finish this out. So 2 minus 3i, and then 4 plus 5i. It does not matter what side they go on. So 2 times 4 is 8. Negative 3i times 4 is negative 12i. 2 times 5i is 10i. Negative 3i times 5i is negative 15i squared. So now I just add up all the things in the box. So 8 minus 12i plus 10i minus 15i squared. So if I combine negative 12i and 10i, I get negative 2i. And I know that I squared is negative 1. So minus 15 times negative 1. So negative 15 times negative 1 is positive 15. So I have an 8 and a positive 15. When I combine those, I get 23. And I still have that minus 2i. And that is our answer. And then our last example. So negative 4 minus 5i and then negative 4 plus 5i. So negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. Negative 4 times negative 5i is positive 20i. Negative 4 times positive 5i is negative 20i. Then 5i times negative 5i is negative 25i squared. So I'm going to add up all those. So 16 plus 20i minus 20i minus 25i squared. So I know you don't have this little extra space out here, so just try to write maybe smaller than I am. 20i plus negative 20i is 0, so those cancel each other out. So I'm left with 16 minus 25i squared, but I know that I squared is negative 1. So negative 25 times negative 1 is positive 25. So 16 plus 25 is 41, and that's our answer. So that is it for the notes. We're not going to talk about the complex conjugate. Those are on my website if you want to check those out to see what they are, but we're not going to have to deal with those. So that's it for the notes.